Now, without further ado, I'm proud to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jim Kolisch. Professor Jim Kolisch is the founding director of Elmhurst University's Masters in Data Science program. Jim has a PhD in mathematics from Northwestern University and a strong interest in ways modern data can have a positive impact in many settings. In addition to over 30 years of teaching experience, Jim has held senior roles in both technology and general management. Welcome, Dr. Kolisch.
Thank you very much, Raj, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's good to be with you all today. I just want to confirm that you're all able to see my slide at the moment here. Just a little hiccup here at the last moment getting things set up, but I think we're in good shape now. So let's move forward. So again, it's a real pleasure to be here. As Raj mentioned, I have been in the business of education for a long time. Teaching, working as a senior administrator and senior executive for the institution, working in the world of technology, and over these past few years, concentrating on this world of data science, which I find fascinating and wonderful. So I am an observer. That's how I spend most of my time as someone who teaches. So what I hope to do for you today is to share some observations that I have made over a period of time. And you will see as we go through this, I'm going to be tapping many different sources with links that are available for you so that you can go farther and dive into this to any extent that you might want. But my main goal will be to give you a sense of what this world of AI is all about and how you might transform it into something that will be a source of value for you in the work that you're going to do. All right, so let's dive in. So first of all, what I would call the exciting news, and this is, you're going to see my inclination in all of this. You may have a different post. So just in the last couple of weeks or so, I was reading a post from CIO.com from a consultant named Paul Gaynor. And Mr. Gaynor said something that I found to be utterly remarkable. And it was this, that advanced business analytics gives you the ability to see and predict everything everywhere. That's a bold statement, right? I mean, is it hype? Maybe. But I do believe that Mr. Gaynor is essentially right, that what he's talking about is what our world has now made available to us. And how you might react to that, well, that might well be anything from the kind of excitement that I generally feel most days about this to perhaps terror, right? I mean, we've seen some of the downsides of all of this too. What I'd like to propose to you today is that while your reaction may be somewhere on that gamut, that the real question needs to be, how is it that we're able to use what we now have and what we will have to create something of meaningful value for your organization? And so that's what I want to talk about. So let's start with just a lay of the land to get some idea of what is going on these days. And again, I'm going to be drawing resources from many, many different places. The links are available on each slide. I urge you to follow them further if you so wish. So this is a collection of some recent blog posts coming from many different domains. And while we see a bunch of different areas in which certainly AI is active these days, what I'd like to do is point out to you a couple of characteristics that these have in common and that may resonate with the worlds in which you are in. So the first characteristic that you see across some of these titles is what I would call a movement toward the edge. That what we're really talking about is artificial intelligence, not as a backroom sort of thing, but as something that is right there, right in front of your customers, your employees, people who are doing the day-by-day work in whatever situation you might be in. And that's very much the case, that today's applications of artificial intelligence are pushing us very much toward this customer, employee, human edge, number one. Number two, again, you can look through some of these words here and you will notice how granular these topics tend to be, so that we're moving away from a world in which we tend to do broad brush kinds of things to a world that is almost hyper-personalized in some ways.
Professor, sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. Can you navigate the slides? I think people are...
What are we missing? Are we missing the slides?
Yes. Have you been navigating the slides?
Check my share. Again, my apologies here. Let me double check my share. I'm going to...
No, your slides are showing it's not advancing.
Oh, it's not advancing. All right. Let me see. Again, just bear with me for just a moment here. Let me stop this share and I'll begin a new one. That will probably be the new thing. I see what it is. My apologies. PMI slides. Let's see here. All right. Is it better now?
I think your presentation
you're
is on
in-
the
We're
other
seeing your
screen.
side.
All right, let's see. Okay, hold on here just a minute. And I apologize. We just let me just find out about screen one. That might be what we want to do. That. Let's try that. See if that's any better. All right, let's try that. We better now? Let's just,
Yes.
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, sorry for the hiccup there, but okay. Anyway, so my point being that we're moving toward the edge, number one. Number two, that we're moving into a world that's very granular. So we're really looking at almost micro level kinds of insights, micro level pieces of information that are useful, and not the kind of broad brushed approach that's been out there for a long time. Things that are personalized, we're attempting to accelerate things that are goal driven. So we'll see this as we go. So a couple of more specific examples, and again, you will find these, I think many of these in whatever situation you might be in. So the question is, what are we trying to do? So perhaps things like presenting targeted digital ads, things like managing customer churn, matching customer needs and supplier offerings, or predicting asset maintenance questions. Pause for a moment and go back to that idea at the beginning of that we are in a position now where we can essentially predict anything everywhere. In that world, the question then becomes for you, what can you predict? What do you want to predict? And we're going to see that that door is going to open a whole lot as we go. There's some really interesting work out there very recently. A post I read just yesterday is talking about the use of some of these approaches and tools to help manage the wildfires that have happened in the West this summer. Right? The point being that in the old days, what you had to do was really almost manually look at satellite data to try to get some sense of perhaps where a fire might be spreading, where a resource might be best applied. And in today's world, with the use of some artificial intelligence techniques, we're able to, in fact, take all of that video image and very quickly extract the useful information from it that will allow, say, the people involved with the firefighting enterprise to direct their resources in a much more targeted and much more efficient kind of way, that the patterns that are available in those videos can be extracted in much better and much newer kinds of ways, right? And the question then becomes, what do we want to predict? Well, we're predicting there what will happen next with the fire and what do we do about it? So there might be an inclination to think that AI is mostly about things rather mundane and just trying to automate relatively straightforward, simple kinds of tasks that are done in most organizations. But it's interesting to note that is not the case, that we are, in fact, these days able to use AI in some ways that are much more creative in nature. So there's an example that comes from the fashion industry and looking at the ability to predict perhaps what a customer might like based on some of their past buying patterns, based on some relatively basic information that they might provide, and to, in fact, start a productive chain that begins at a prediction of what someone might like, and ultimately allows, say, for a fashion organization to customize the production of their own product. So rather than having to keep a whole ton of material in inventory, they're able to move toward a much closer match between what someone really wants and what they're ultimately able to produce. So yet another example. Yet another level in this particular illustration too, and the idea of moving beyond just solving a particular problem to actually monetizing data, right? So thinking of the data themselves that are gathered as a potential asset that can be used in other ways and in other settings and potentially across organizational lines. Yet another direction where much of this will continue to go. So lots of areas of organizational impact. Some of them probably feel pretty familiar, others less so, right? So certainly the idea of maybe AI and personal assistants, we're all totally used to Alexa and Siri and whatever else might be out there. But some that may be a little bit less familiar in some ways, right? So the blog post by this organization, Lasse Runan, talking about things like AI and accounting, right? So once again, if you think about, say, an audit process, that most financial audits are relatively routine in nature. They tend to follow a fairly set pattern with a lot of predictability along the way. If there's a lot of predictability along the way, that's something that would be open to access via the world of AI. Or even legal work, right? If you think about the business of attempting to identify what legal precedents might be for various cases, This normally involves many, many hours of tedious searching through different sources and resources, the kind of thing that is very much ripe for automation through the world of AI, and is very much a direction that things are beginning to move. So a question you might have is, well, how about your own areas, right? In what ways might AI impact your area, or even perhaps at some level supplant some of what you're doing? And so it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but there is a website out there that you might fool with called willrobotstakemyjob.com. willrobotstakemyjob.com, that ironically I think uses a bit of AI, but attempts to give some estimate of the extent to which any particular line of work out there might be in fact vulnerable to some higher degree, or maybe even a very big degree of automation through AI. So if you're interested, that's something that you might take a peek at and see where it goes. On the other hand, enormous potential is out there. And again, I think some of this is somewhat familiar at this point, perhaps not. And the potential lies at a lot of different levels. A point I want to make with you early on, and that is that while some of the really large scale kinds of applications get the press, get the news, get the attention, that a lot of value lies in doing things that are in fact much smaller in scope and scale and much more routine. And that's, once again, the number one question to keep in mind, I believe, in all of this work is, how do you create value in whatever setting you might be operating? So again, a few more examples. And so in the world of healthcare, it's been the case for a while now that the ability to detect anomalies on radiograms, so on CT scans or X-rays or things of that sort, that artificial intelligence can, say, detect the presence of a cancerous tumor much quicker and often with much more accuracy than even a well-trained radiologist can do by looking at it kind of one by one by one by one. So it's an area where the patterns are complex, but yet predictable. And that's the kind of thing that AI can do very well. Of course, it raises the question of how well does it do, and how do you handle exceptions that might arise? And that's another important question to consider, one we'll come back to. Maybe the world of agriculture, right? So here's where we see the use of sensors being very prevalent. That if you run a farm, a modern farm, you have the ability to plant sensors, cheap little $2 sensors all over the place, right? That could sensor anything from water levels in your soil, moisture levels in your soil, through activity of, say, the animals that live on your farm. And so the sensors start throwing off lots and lots of data that reflect patterns that are meaningful, and that might allow you to, say, calibrate a drip irrigation unit in a way that might be more efficient, or might allow you to detect particular movement patterns in your animals that suggest that perhaps they are ill, or perhaps it's time to give birth for the cow, or something like that. These are the kinds of things that are becoming very real. Really interesting book if you're looking for a good read, one called Future Proof by a columnist named Kevin Roose. And he mentions a couple cases in there that are kind of fascinating, lest again you think that this is just the mundane. The world of journalism, right? So it's fairly straightforward to use AI to read text and perhaps, say, convert text to voice. That's something we've done for a while. But how about generating text? So there's a piece of software out there called GPT-3, for example, that if you give it a prompt, will generate a long form piece of text that will be very good, that will get the basic job done of communicating the ideas that need to be put across in whatever that piece might be. Or even in the world of music, there's a piece of software out there called JukeDeck, for example, that will, I forget exactly what the prompts are, but basically write for you an original piece of music that will be quite decent, right? It's not going to win an award, but as the author suggests, it will be decent enough to, say, be usable in a jingle or a commercial or an application of that sort. So I think my point here is this that I want to make with you, and that is that whatever you might think this world of AI is all about, it is most likely broader and deeper. Broader in a sense that it's covering more fields than you might imagine, and deeper that it is more capable than you might think. But at the same time, it's not broader and deeper in ways that many people might fear, right? There are things that AI can't do. And again, in the world of project management, the idea of managing scope, that's going to be, as we'll see, absolutely essential in our thinking about the world of AI. So what I will put forward for you is this notion that one thing that AI cannot do right now and will never likely be able to do is exercise good judgment. That good judgment is a human capability, and it's an essential human capability in any of these kinds of projects. And as we'll see, this combination of what AI can and can't deliver and combined with what we deliver as humans will be, I believe, the best way forward for many of us in many of our circumstances. Okay, I want to get into this just a little bit more to begin to move towards some practical ideas that I hope you're able to use. But just to make sure we're on the same page here, what we're talking about for the most part is a flow that looks something like this that you see on this screen. Now, people will argue about what exactly is or isn't artificial intelligence. Is it the same as this machine learning stuff? And those are perfectly fine arguments. I want to avoid them today. So I don't feel it's useful for us to spend much time on that. So let's not get too hung up on precise details here. They really don't matter that much. But for the most part, what we're looking at is this ongoing cycle that starts with information in digital form, which can be any information at all these days, that flows into what we call machine learning, which are nothing more than algorithms and tools that will basically create predictions for us. And then it's those predictions that fuel our artificial intelligence applications that do all of the kinds of things that I began to talk about in the last few slides. So that basically simulate human activity using some sort of a machine. I'd like to propose for you that when you make use of these kinds of tools and approaches, there are essentially two different endpoints that you can arrive at, two different kinds of projects that you can advance. One of them is all about making decisions. So this is about creating essentially what we would call information gain, finding patterns in the data, seeing into the data in ways that perhaps aren't obvious, that allow you essentially to make better decisions as an organization in some way. So you might better plan your sales efforts or your marketing efforts or your ability to retain customers or your ability to read a CAT scan, whatever it might be. But it's ultimately a human decision-making process at the back end that gets supported by the AI. That's one path. The other path is the path to automation, where you're actually creating some sort of a product that does its own thing. They're certainly related. They both sit on the same platform at one level, but they're really quite different. And once again, I would encourage you to keep track of both of these channels, that the automation channel, while it's absolutely powerful and it's transformative in many ways, is the channel that's getting a lot of attention these days. But yet it may well be the case in your own setting, in your organization setting, that good attention to the decision-making channel may well be the source of value. And at the same time, if we think about sort of how these processes work, and this is one slide that describes the more technical side of the data science process, one thing you will notice is that it's quite iterative, right? And it has to be. So it's both structured and iterative, which to me at least makes it a very good candidate for some of the hybrid agile type approaches that are out there. And that I think is something that's very much worth thinking about as you approach your own management of data science, artificial intelligence kinds of projects. So one more little aside on background, and a book that I really enjoy that came out a couple years back by 3 economists out of the University of Toronto called Prediction Machines. And they made an interesting, they took an interesting view. They thought like economists about this and said, well, all right, so a couple things. First of all, let's understand that all of this fancy stuff, what is happening is essentially the creation of a probability estimate. That's all any of this can ever do, is estimate the probability that something that you're focusing on will occur or not. That's all it can do, no more, no less. It's never certain. And so that's how it makes its predictions, right? That says, well, all right, you have some threshold. And if that threshold is exceeded, we'll predict that whatever it is, the customer stayed, the customer left, that will happen. The thing is, though, with our tools and techniques, what our economists tell us is that the price of prediction is falling very rapidly. And what an economist will say is that, well, if the price falls rapidly, what happens? People want to do whatever that thing is a lot more. They make a couple good points. And again, a way to think about framing your own work. Prediction machines, they say, are better than humans at factoring in complex interactions among different indicators. And if you don't believe that, just think about any complicated situation and our ability as humans to really sort of get at the nut of it in a way that's effective. We're not built to do that especially well. And the machines do an extremely good job when data are rich. They also scale, so you can get to very, very large scale kinds of operations. On the other hand, we as humans are better at machines when understanding the why of what's going on, the processes, how did the data get generated, especially in situations when there are not a lot of data available. In a way, we're maybe not at the beginning of this journey, but we're relatively close to it. So this is a slide that I put together from back in 1994, which was really kind of near the beginnings of the internet age. This was the very first banner ad that was ever posted. It was posted in Wired magazine. It looks a little bit grainy because it was. I forget the number of pixels it had, but it was small. But the idea was this was a wholly new thing, right? Nobody had really any idea that advertising on a screen like this, where people clicked and did things, would lead to much of anything. 94 was a year in which Amazon was just being born. Google was still a pipe dream that didn't come around for a few more years. But if you imagine sort of the mindset of 1994 and where we are now, and project that sort of a leap to what we're doing in this world of artificial intelligence, it raises some interesting possibilities. And our authors suggest, I think, this idea at the top, which I believe is exactly right, that we each, machines and humans, have distinct strengths and weaknesses when it comes to this business of making predictions. As the machines improve, which they are very quickly, our organizations and you as managers and project managers will be needing to adjust your division of labor between humans and machines in response to this. Where does this all start? Likely with more repetitive processes, high volume processes, rule-based processes. But as we've already begun to see, it's going to get beyond there and is beyond there pretty quickly. All right, so that's the news, right? That's the baseline. Part two, though, is the bad news. And let me give you the bad news. The bad news is this, and this comes from there's actually many sources, but this particular one is from a group of venture capitalists and looking at things through those eyes. So 87% of data science projects, AI projects, never make it into production, right? And that's still not terribly far from true. So the question becomes why? And I think there are a couple of fundamental reasons to think about. And we're going to see there's a way out of all of this here that you are an important part of. So the first set of reasons really lie at the organizational level, senior leadership. So the failure of executives to think in strategic ways, the failure to view the artificial intelligence and all that goes with it as an enterprise investment and asset, rather than as some sort of technical thing that happens in the back room. So that kind of thinking becomes the first barrier that many organizations face to moving forward. And what that can often mean is that attention to things like siloing, right? When you have one group doing things separate from another, that's usually the kiss of death for most of these kinds of projects. And an organization that's not being sufficiently strategic won't see that. Some other issues that come into play that you have to consider. It's realistic expectations, and this is a big problem. I've seen this with some of my graduates, and this advice I will give them from the point of view of careers in this area. And that is that if you're on either extreme, so if you're in an organization that somehow thinks AI is going to save the world, that this is just a magic solution to everything, that's a big problem. It can't, it's limited. And as we're going to see, we're going to take a very different look at where we ought to go with this. And there are some really epic failures that are out there, and some that we're seeing right now with, say, even Facebook and Zillow and some situations like that. One I can point you toward was a company that was an interesting entrepreneurial effort that noticed that people like kind of cute t-shirts with little 2-3 word sayings on them, and noticed that some of these sayings were kind of random in nature. So this entrepreneur built a company out that did quite well for a while, that basically used a little bit of AI to generate sayings. And again, they were kind of cute, they were kind of funny, they were a bit random, built sort of a collection of words and really didn't watch much at all, just let the t-shirts generate on their own and put them out there and sold them effectively. All was great until some t-shirts started to come out that had some offensive things on it. And the point was, this was not the intent, but by letting the AI just do its own thing and not paying sufficient attention, the whole thing essentially collapsed on itself. The company was lost. So the idea of realistic expectations is important, and that's there. Thinking about the notion of correlation and causation, that we live in the world of things being related, correlation here, and jumping to the idea that because things are related, they're going to cause each other. is a jump we don't want to make necessarily. Again, the antidote is grounding things in the setting, the business setting in which you are operating, thinking carefully about what business value means, and we're going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes. There's a protocol that gets used in the world of data science, or several, but this one's called the CRISP protocol, which stands for the Cross-Industry Standard Protocol for Data Mining. Again, I don't have time today to walk through, but it's an iterative pass through different stages like these. I think here's one reason that things can sometimes go wrong. That especially in a setting where not enough attention is paid to the really top level executive sponsorship, it can be easy to default to the technical and to things technical, which means that of the 5 stages, the one that really gets attention is that one in the middle. But yet what really needs to happen is something more like this, that the value that occurs when good attention is paid to the beginning and the end. And I would argue I'd probably put data in green too, as we're going to see that that's also a major difference maker. Okay, so 87% of projects fail. The hopeful news is, though, that you can fix that there's a lot that you can do about that, and that you as project managers have particularly important roles in making this occur. Let's dive into that for a while. So back to our process. So once again, I want to talk about the 2 endpoints, right? Again, hitting automation on the far end, which I'm going to talk a little about today. That's its own thing. I really want to focus on the decision-making side more, because again, I think that's where you're going to see the most bang for your buck as you go forward in the world that you are doing. And I've seen my students do this, right? I've seen, for example, a brilliant little application where the problem was to come up with a pricing tool that the sales agents at the front end had some discretion as to what level of discount they might be allowed to offer under certain guidelines and such. But we're really struggling as to how to make a choice. And what one of my students did was to use some good internal data from the organization to, in fact, create a little piece of software that guided that. It wasn't a big giant deployment. It was essentially something that was just done in Excel, but that ended up making a huge difference in terms of what the people at the front end could do, right? So again, what's the prediction and what needs to be made? So let's think about decisions for just a little bit. So decisions can be decomposed like this, right? There's an action, offer a discount, a consequence, customers increase their demand, or maybe they don't. So there's a consequence, but with uncertainty. And then something happens. Maybe revenues, profits go up, maybe they don't, right? So on the one hand, there's sort of this nice smooth flow, but on the other hand, it's very much less than certain. We have to deal with uncertainty in this world. And in any kind of larger or more complex setting, there are many of these actions, consequences that interact with results. And so what we have to do then is ask ourselves, how can we, in fact, try to essentially take a CAT scan of all of this in a way that will allow us to get better results? And that's where we're going to go next. As a first step in what you might do in your work is to get better at, in fact, knowing what the results are and quantifying those through KPIs. Let me give you some tips that might help. One is general in nature, and again, this is probably quite familiar to you, but it's the 5 whys or 5 or so whys, right? So the idea being that if you ask the question why enough times, typically around 5, maybe it's 3 or 4, you can get closer to root causes and core issues. So create a customer loyalty program. Why? Because you want to reward loyal customers. Why? Because you want to incentivize customers to stay longer with the company. Why? Because you want to increase your revenues in the longer term. Okay, that sort of flow. My point is that when you get to that last stage, now you have something quantified that you can use with all of this machine learning stuff that ultimately can drive some sort of a decision support mechanism or other piece of AI. And this is a pathway to getting to KPIs. Still another is the notion of value mapping, which is really about 2 basic questions. Who is your client and what does success mean for your client? So a quick example of what one of these value maps might look like. So value map for, say, a production manager in an organization. So read something like this. Mega International can help the customer's production manager. That second column might be the production manager, might be the sales manager, might be the HR director, could be anybody. I'll stop here for a moment and make the point that the very same data, the very same project work might be done in very different ways when you're working with different clients. And that's important to understand, that it's not about the project, it's about the client, first of all, and the very specific client. All right, so we can help the production manager in this case to do what? Improve profitability of existing machines by increasing their productivity, reducing waste, so forth and so on, by doing some things like enhancing the line speeds and so on. Those last two columns become the ingredients that your data scientists are going to use in their models. And if you do this stage right, you will be giving them better ingredients with which to work and giving yourself a chance at much better results at the back end. So the KPIs, think about the key performance indicators as measuring the outcomes, where you want to land, right? How you will measure success or failure of your work. That's the third column. The do what column gets you to those. That's what you want to predict. That's your target, so to speak. And the way all of this works is you have a target, an output you want to predict, and you have a whole collection of inputs that might help predict that. That's what your fourth column is all about. So these are the ideas. These are ideas for things you might use. They're called features in this world that get fed in. Projects that fail don't pay enough attention to do these two pieces, that the idea of feeding the right data and the right features into the models. That by far is the biggest difference maker when it comes to attempting to get a model that's going to work well. And so there again, you as project managers are in a particularly good place, or as organizational managers, to go through exercises like these that help sharpen and clarify what the targets are, the third column, and your data science people will use that, and what's going to affect those targets, the fourth column. And then the idea is when the day is done, you're moving then beyond kind of a general statement that says, hey, we need a better line speed, to a specific concrete recommendation driven by data, driven by a good model, driven by experience that will provide guidance as to how precisely to adjust that line speed so that you can move forward. And again, I'm not going to take too much time on this here just in the interest of time, but here was our fashion industry case. And if you read this particular article, what you find was that the KPIs they came up with, there were many. So it wasn't one project, it was several all over the place that were interesting. And I'm sorry, that the ingredients, this is not the KPI slide, this is the feature slide, the inputs, that there were many inputs, and that when the day was done, results like these emerged, that this kind of careful look hit all kinds of beneficial outcomes in that world. Okay, so that's my first bit of advice to you, is basically get the question right. And the question is not primarily a technical question, it's a value question. A question that you as a project manager need to work at the center of, bringing the right people together so you can then identify what those questions are going to be that will lead to projects in data science or artificial intelligence that in the end create good value. Part one. Part two are two simple related questions. Are your data right, and do you have the right data? Data are notorious, right? And again, I could go a whole hour as to what goes wrong with data, but things like just errors in entry, changes in systems, inconsistencies, outliers, lots and lots of different things that require tons of attention and time to get right. And that's a very essential part of the work. And do you have the right data? I have yet to see a project where the data that someone was handed was exactly the same set of data used at the back end. But there is what we call an engineering process, a feature engineering process that goes on along the way that can often call for a whole different set of data with which to work. Let me give you one example that I use in some of my classes that's interesting and I think will make the point for you. So the problem here was to make a choice between two buildings for commercial rental purposes. And the goal was to maximize commercial rent 3 years downstream. So the traditional approach was to look at the two buildings and to look at a whole bunch of real estate metrics. That these are familiar, well-known. Rent per square foot versus what's happening in the zip code, vacancy rate, things like that. And it turned out that if you did that, the two buildings looked essentially the same, that it was pretty much impossible to distinguish them. But at the same time, what this project group did was to understand that they didn't really have the right question, that it really was not a question about buildings. It was a question about people who were going to occupy those buildings. It was not a question about rent, ultimately, although that's what they wanted. It was a question about who can they bring in that is willing to pay higher rents. It was a question about people. And so what they said was, all right, let's try to identify other indicators that might point to a location that would bring people in willing to pay a slightly higher rent. Well, and the idea was that if people are willing to pay a little bit more for other things, they might be willing to pay a little more for rent too. So they started looking at things like ratings of bars or distance to high-priced restaurants and a variety of other things like that. And when the day was done, it turned out that these new variables, these non-traditional sources of information, these dynamic variables that measured sort of changes, activity in the area, were far more important. They in fact provided 60% of the predictive power of the model over the more traditional metrics that were present. And in fact, ended up getting a very good result, that it made a prediction that was both differentiating and right, which is an interesting thing. Even in your world of project management directly, right? Here's one illustration from one of my colleagues, John Aaron, who runs an organization called Milestone Research. Has a tool out there he has created called PRIMS. And so if you think about the idea of moving forward from one phase to the next in a project, so you have the formal project management reporting and sort of the estimate of readiness to move forward. That's in red here. But we know that there are pressures to sometimes overestimate, to give a rosy picture for that, right? So what John has been working on is the idea of being able to systematically capture the voice of the team, people closer to the front, working on the project to get their estimates from what they're seeing. They may be the same, they may be different. The question then becomes, how do you reconcile these differences? And that's, again, where some of our data science techniques can make a big difference. And so the idea then becomes one that runs something like this. If, let's say, in order to have enough confidence to move to the next phase, you need to be 90% sure you're ready. Well, 90% is much more likely on the red base curve than it is on the blue base curve, which is the mix of the two. The ability to have that insight may well allow you to identify a potential source of project failure much earlier, right? On the other hand, if things happen to be working together well, you're going to be in a good place. So modern data, as we've seen, are all over the place. So it can come from internal systems such as ERP, CRM, things like that. Certainly external sources, doesn't have to be numbers, can be text, things like Yelp reviews. I've seen some really interesting data flows around location data that basically a company that will sell essentially foot traffic data and give you a sense of, in a particular geographic setting, how much foot traffic exists drawn from cell phone data. And the question becomes, how do you organize, how do you manage all of this? And there's a whole area of practice that's emerged called data ops. That's sort of a combination of a more agile approach to project management, or maybe hybrid software development project management and lean manufacturing. And it essentially says you have to manage, in the world of data ops, two things. So the idea of the actual product development, which is the vertical axis going up, and then the idea of the actual data flow, automating as much as possible and trying to rationalize the data coming from all of these different perspectives is a part of what data ops is all about. Okay, so that's lesson number 2. Lesson number 1 was ask the right question, especially from a business point of view. Make sure that's happening. Question about what value you're looking to create and for whom. Question number 2 is this collection of, do you have the right data and are the data right? An investment of time in that will pay off tremendously in terms of project success downstream. Question number 3 is really about evaluating your work, right? So what is the best model? And once again, your technical people will take a technical perspective, but it'll be incomplete. You also want a business perspective here. Quick example. Goal is to predict churn, people leaving your company, and I won't go into the details here, but typically in cases like this where there's kind of an imbalance, not too much churn to be had, there'll be some ways that you kind of get things even first. But here's the idea. 2 models. In model 1, if you look at it, this is what we call a confusion matrix, basically predicts churn correctly all the time, but also has some false positives. Predicts a fair number of people, maybe 40%, that will in fact, are predicted to churn but don't. And it has, in a larger sense, an overall accuracy of 64%. Whereas model B has a purported accuracy of 96%, reasons behind what we're going to do, but misses a lot of people who are churning, only get 60% of them. What do you care more about, right? Do you care more about actually catching the people that leave, even if you falsely predict that some others might leave too? Or do you care about basically not getting things wrong, that predicting that if someone's going to leave, they really do? That's not math, folks. That's not AI. That's a business decision. That's a project management decision. That's a question you have to ask up front, and then make sure that the decisions made downstream in the work reflect the values that you're bringing to the project. Another idea that we have to wrestle with is an idea called overfitting. So this is all about seeing phantom patterns, essentially. That it's a function of how things are organized, that every model that you build in this world will make some mistakes. And the question is, how do you manage that? And that's something that you have to keep in mind. Still, another thing to keep in mind is staying power. So if you build a model, will that model continue to be valid as you go forward? And that has two levels of questioning attached to it. One is, as you go, with as much as you know, are you sure that you are building a sufficient weight of evidence in favor of the model to carry it forward? That's question number one. But here's an interesting question that sometimes gets ignored. And this is an after the fact question that may well have you rethink what the scope of your project is. And I'm encouraging you to think about adding at the back end some essentially after project scope that looks for what we would call model drift. And this is nothing more than a case where the models you built to power your AI no longer reflect reality. Reality has changed. Maybe there's been a sudden change, COVID. Maybe there's been some sort of a gradual drift. Maybe it's been sort of a smooth incremental drift. Maybe there's been a drift and then it's come back. Things change all the time, and it's absolutely vital to keep up with those changes and to be able to monitor and recognize those so you can improve your models. So a couple more points and then I'll stop for questions. Other issues to think about, McKinsey puts out a nice list here in this particular post. Interpretability, so if you have a fancy model but no one can see inside of it, is that something that your client will buy, will trust? And again, this idea of incorporating your client, incorporating your experts all the way through the cycle gives you the best chance of building that trust that you need in order for your models to succeed, which leads me into my last point, a point you know very well, and that's the point of change management. I like my colleague John's slide on this, which is basically suggesting that in order for this to really work, we have to think about not only the technical side, kind of system readiness, but the whole user acceptance lifecycle, that these are not separate things, but rather need to be pieces that work together. So I'm going to close here in just the next 2 minutes so we can have time for questions. We're back to our 87% failure rate. So how do you fix that, right? What are some things you can do? And again, two individuals here, Deborah Leff, who was the Chief Technical Officer for IBM, and Chris Chapo, who was the Senior Vice President for Analytics for The Gap, were the two people in this. They suggested the following 3 or 4 things. First of all, to think about how, if you are a senior organizational leader, how you are educated. If you are part of the team, how you're able to contribute to the education of the people at the top as to what's possible and what's reasonable in your own setting. That's one. I think awareness of this as a manager, and I love this slide, this piece in red rather, that managers who use AI, or let's back up, AI is not going to replace people, but managers who use AI are going to replace those who don't. I think that's absolutely insightful and prescient. I think number 3, that companies no longer compete against their closest competitor. They're actually competing against the best customer experience someone else has provided, even if it's an entirely different sector. It gets again back to asking the right question, framing the question right, quantifying it, going forward. And then if you're new to this, starting small, again, being very focused, maybe focusing on a pain point first, getting the right people together, working cross-functionally to solve your problem, using the resources that you have available. So as you can tell, I'd be happy to talk about this all day. There's a lot here that we can cover, but let me just leave you then with 3 takeaways, and I will stop and take some questions at that point. So once again, ask the right questions in the work that you're doing, pay real attention to the data. Are the data right? Do you have the right data? And essentially manage change well, the human organizational side, both during the project and after, and from the point of view of recognizing when the work that you have done may need to change because the world around you has also changed. So I'll stop there, folks. I thank you for your attention here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have and offer any insights I can that are useful. And if you want to reach out to me privately, there's my email. I'm happy to chat with you that way too. Please do. So Raj, I'll turn it back to you, and we can go from there perhaps. And I'll stop my share and take questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kulich, for your insightful presentation. I think we all agree that we learned a great deal about gaining an understanding of the forms of modern data that an organization can tap into. gaining an understanding of ways today's data and AI capabilities can be used to create value for organizations, and gaining an understanding of effective approaches for managing data science and AI projects in an organization. So now let's start the Q&A session. I'll allow for the audience to unmute yourselves to ask your questions. Okay. All right. So if you could still post questions in the chat box if you prefer, but you can also unmute and ask your questions directly. Let's keep it interactive.
So I might offer a comment here from the chat box from Beth. I completely agree. The idea of high percentage of failure is due to faulty assumptions made early on and not reconsidered later in the delivery process. I think that's very insightful and very true, right? And I think it fits very well with this notion of consistently revisiting in an iterative fashion what the assumptions are and how they need to change as you go. That's, I think, a very key element in the success or failure of these kinds of projects. I see a question about aspects of project management you think AI will take over, and for what aspects do we still need humans? I think that's an excellent question. So first of all, the good news is I think we'll always need humans, right? That this notion of judgment being an important element of the mix, and of the ability to deal with especially the special cases, the exceptional cases, the cases that aren't driven by a lot of data. Those are absolutely the work that carries that humans will need to handle. But I think a couple of things. I think that the AI may not take over, but I think it will support some of the more routine aspects of project management. So some of the reporting, information gathering and reporting, right? AI, robotic process automation is one version of this that some don't call AI, but I would. That may well be able to routinize this business of translating sort of the expected flows of information into the kinds of reports that need to go out. There's that piece. Perhaps some of your resource allocation work can be informed by some models under the hood. But I think the idea of project risk management and the ability to identify risks in a project easier and sooner and more fully, and then adapt to those and address those is an area that shows a lot of promise. Again, my colleague John Aaron's doing a lot of work in that sort of area. And that may mean capturing information from your team, from your customers. It could mean looking at things like project logs and being able through some AI and some text analytics to identify, especially in large complex projects, signals in those logs that might suggest something is going awry and to send some sort of an alert. And that again is, I think, the output of a lot of this is the ability to automate alerts to the right people when they are necessary, when something is being detected that is going out of the appropriate scope of the moment, right? So out of a good, maybe good process control sort of approach. I think those are all areas where you might well see some work there. Question from Joseph, from your experience, there are a couple of specific AI efforts various governments are doing that are interesting or concerning. Yeah, face recognition, military applications. For sure, there's no doubt that there is risk in this, and no doubt that that in the mix of what's going on, we are seeing and will see some high-profile, high-impact mistakes. There's no question that's the case. And so the question becomes, how do you mitigate that, right? What is it that you're able to do? And once again, I think the mitigation comes from this careful attention to inclusion of the right set of voices at the front end, right? So bias and face recognition is really driven essentially by not having enough faces of the right sort in the mix when the algorithms are trained. That is the fundamental reason behind, say, a face recognition approach that might go awry. And then sort of the right kind of appropriate regulation, and I mean, you can argue how you want about governmental regulation, but the right kind of monitoring that is able to, once again, detect this notion of drift, right? To know when something is beginning to go wrong before it's a catastrophe. Those are at least a couple of thoughts that I might offer for that. And it's going to be incumbent upon us, I think, as professionals and as experts to work with our governmental leaders and others to try to find ways to do this that don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because as we've seen on the other side of this, there are some potentially very, very powerful outcomes that can and are being achieved with this sort of work. So a couple thoughts there from Rajesh. A few years ago, an organization invested a lot in big data, data lakes, got confused and overwhelmed. Now it's picking up with that. Sure, it will be a big ticketed item. What's your thoughts on this? Yeah, again, I think this is a cart before the horse issue, I believe. So there can be a temptation to go to the technical first. Let's get let's get our data right. Let's buy the big data lake. Let's pour it all in there. Let's go after it, because after all, that's what everybody's doing. The question I would have is, has the organization asked the question why? Have they gone through the 5 whys first? My guess, and again, I don't know the setting certainly, but my guess is that eventually you are going to come up with some sort of a data lake or other sort of data environment, but that it might look very different if you have clarity upfront about why you're doing it, what kinds of problems you're looking to solve, what your understanding of your current data flows are, what your sense of your future data needs might be, things like that. And so that can be sort of what the data governance looks like. So you've got all this data. What are your policies? How do you ensure that it gets into enough hands in the right ways to be useful, but not into the wrong hands? So I think attention to those sorts of organizational questions, governance questions, kind of design questions can make a difference and perhaps get you to a place that you have your data organized in a lake or some other kind of setting in a way it's more productive, that's perhaps more efficient, less costly, and more connected to generating the value you seek more quickly. A couple of general thoughts on that. Other questions here? All right. Yes.
Professor, let me ask you, so how might a smaller or less experienced organization get started with AI and machine learning?
Sure. Okay.
Do you have?
Sure, I can offer a couple thoughts on that, Raj. I think, so start small and start specific, right? That realize that if you're smaller, you don't have to have a big win. You don't have to boil the ocean to move forward. What you want is something that will be noticeable, meaningful, that will make a difference in business terms to you. And in particular, if it's possible, starting with a pain point, something that's just not working very well, right? The old adage that you sell more aspirin than vitamins, I think holds very well here. And if you're able to, in fact, do that, that would be a good thing. So I would say start small, go through this value map exercise about what it is that you're looking to do. Look at your data, be sure that you have a reasonable amount of data with which to work, and then take a first approach at it, right? Again, you don't necessarily need to have a full-on piece of AI before you're done. Maybe even a good exploration up front that yields a useful report will be enough to make a difference, and you might stop. Or you might find impetus there to go forward and to engage in a deeper machine learning kind of operation. So something like that, I think, would be a way to go with a smaller organization. Question from Curtis: would you think the whys be done at mid-level followed by senior level? That's a really interesting point, and I would tend to agree that that's, I guess my reaction is there's no reason that the whys can't be done at all sorts of levels, but for sure, the kinds of insights that are obtainable from people who are closer to the front and posing the whys question to them, I believe could produce a tremendous amount of value if done well. Again, the politics of it, of course, that you have to deal with. But I think that's a smart idea and one that would be worth exploring, right? Because ultimately, what we want are ideas about what kinds of results matter and what will drive them that reflect reality, and not perhaps a more distant view of reality that can sometimes be the case if you're at the most senior level only. Thank you, Curtis. That's a great idea. So I guess, Raj, you have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if folks
Yes.
have other things here that we would like to talk about. I guess I would encourage you.
3 more minutes.
Sure. So again, please post if you want. Thank you. Right. I appreciate taking the time on Saturday. I enjoyed this. So thank you all for being here. But let's finish. I guess one thing I would say to you is that real attention to data matters, and be creative. Open your minds, right? And notice that data can be gotten from commercial sources, can be gotten from public sources, and be open to using that. Question from Kirsten, how much technical data knowledge do you think a project manager needs? Enough to know what the more technical people are doing and how to interpret what they're telling you, but not enough that you have to actually do it yourself, right? So it used to be the case that all of this machine learning stuff required people to do a lot of coding, and that's still somewhat the case, but it's more and more automated. People talk about this low code approach out there now and where that takes you. But really your ability to force the right questions, force good attention to gathering the right data, and then question the results in the right way, knowing sort of, for example, how accuracy gets measured and what the options might be. Things like that would be the difference makers, I would say, for a project manager. So one place you can look at. Yeah, Facebook's going to shut down its facial recognition systems. My guess is not forever, but they know they got it wrong. They know that they rushed to the technical too fast without thinking about the ethical, the social, the need to involve diverse perspectives. I think what they're going to have to do is come back to that. And some whole new thing that actually does that more fully and better will be where we might come. That's kind of my first thoughts on Facebook, right? And same sort of thing that's out there with Zillow shutting down their automated estimated tool there. Same kind of problem that they're dealing with too. All right, so I think we've got one more minute.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, there's just one more minute left. So we can conclude our session here.
All right.
Any further questions, I believe participants can email you.
Please do. Jim K at elmhurst.edu. I'm happy to engage in conversation with anyone. I really appreciate all of you taking your time to dive into this, and I appreciate the work that you all do to support good and healthy projects in your organization. I hope that some of this will be useful to you and that some of these tools will in fact help you move your projects forward in some new ways. So good luck to you. And once again, thank you for spending time with me today and with this group here at this good organization, PMI. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kolach. As a token of our appreciation, the chapter would like to present a certificate, and we'll email this to you soon after this event.
Okay.
I'll just display it here, but we'll soon email this to you.
All right, well, that's very kind. Thank you very much, Raj. And thank you for your help with all the technical issues today. I'm glad we were able to make things move forward. So,
sure, no problem.
All right. Have a good rest of your day, folks, and hope to see you again at some point.
All right. I'd also like to thank our audience for your attendance and participating in this discussion. There'll be a raffle at the end of the event. So the raffle winner will need to be present during that time of the draw. So stay till the end. Let me go ahead and stop the recording now.